There is something deeply fascinating about the way fear shapes entire generations. We're not talking about fleeting worries or everyday anxieties, but collective fears that penetrate so deeply into the psyche of a society that they transform the way people think, feel, and behave for the rest of their lives. The 1960s was a singular period in human history, a time when multiple threats converged simultaneously, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and tension that left indelible marks on an entire generation. To truly understand who we are today, we need to look back and understand the ghosts that haunted our parents and grandparents. The 60s were not just an era of cultural changes and social revolutions. They were years of visceral fear, of existential threats that hung over humanity like dark clouds on the horizon. And these clouds didn't simply dissipate when the decade ended. They infiltrated people's minds, shaping their worldview, their priorities, their hopes, and their neuroses in ways that continue to reverberate today. When we think about the 60s, we often romanticize the era. We remember the revolutionary music, the civil rights movements, the counterculture, and the liberation movements. But beneath that colorful and vibrant surface, there was an undercurrent of genuine terror. People of that time lived with the constant awareness that the world could end at any moment, not in some distant future, but literally tomorrow. This wasn't unfounded paranoia. It was a rational response to very real threats that dominated the headlines every single day. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with the time you're watching. Your participation is essential for us to continue producing this type of material. The most prominent and paralyzing fear of the 1960s was, without a doubt, nuclear terror. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had transformed into an arms race that placed humanity on the brink of extinction. People didn't just fear nuclear war in the abstract. They lived knowing that both superpowers possessed arsenals capable of destroying the planet several times over. Children conducted nuclear attack drills in schools, hiding under desks in a ritual that today seems absurdly inadequate for the magnitude of the threat, but at the time was taken extremely seriously. Families built underground shelters in their backyards, stockpiling canned foods, water, and medical supplies. Popular magazines published detailed guides on how to survive a nuclear attack, as if it were possible to simply wait out the radiation and then resume normal life. There was something deeply disturbing about this normalization of the apocalypse. People were trying to domesticate the undomesticable, to make manageable what was essentially unimaginable. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought this threat to the forefront in an unprecedented way. For 13 days, the world literally stood on the brink of total nuclear war. It wasn't an exaggeration. It wasn't media hysteria. Decades later, with the opening of secret archives, we discovered we were even closer to disaster than anyone imagined at the time. Soviet commanders in nuclear submarines had authorization to launch nuclear torpedoes if they lost contact with Moscow. A single Soviet officer, Vasily Arkhipov, vetoed the launch when his colleagues wanted to attack. One man, in a moment of clarity, saved human civilization. But ordinary people didn't know these details at the time. What they knew was that their leaders were in a confrontation that could result in mutually assured destruction. During those 13 days, families gathered around television sets and radios, waiting for news, mentally preparing for the worst. When the crisis finally resolved, the relief was immense, but the psychological trauma remained. The illusion of security had been irrevocably destroyed. People now knew, in a visceral and inescapable way, that everything could end without warning. This knowledge fundamentally changed the collective psychology. It created what psychologists would later call chronic existential anxiety. It wasn't just worry about the future, but a fundamental uncertainty about whether there would be a future. And when you live with this uncertainty, especially during your formative years, it profoundly shapes who you become. Young people who grew up in the 60s developed a peculiar relationship with time. Many adopted a philosophy of living in the present because tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. This manifested in various ways. For some, it meant seizing every moment, seeking intense and authentic experiences, challenging social conventions that seemed absurd in the face of imminent annihilation. Why follow arbitrary rules when the world could end tomorrow? Why postpone happiness, freedom, or authenticity when time might be running out? This mentality fueled many of the countercultural movements of the era. The rejection of authority, experimentation with psychedelic substances, the search for expanded consciousness, the embrace of personal freedom, all of this can be partially understood as psychological responses to a constant existential threat. If civilization could end at any moment, then the old ways of living, the old values, the old hierarchies lost their legitimacy. It was a generation that needed to find meaning in a world where traditional meaning had been called into question by the real possibility of extinction. But not everyone reacted this way. For many people, especially older or more conservative ones, nuclear fear led to a strengthening of traditional values and a search for stability and order. If the world was becoming increasingly chaotic and dangerous, then it was even more important to maintain firm social structures, defend the family, preserve traditional morality. This was the other side of the psychological coin. While some became more radical, others became more conservative, both driven by the same underlying fear. This division created generational and social tensions that defined the decade. It wasn't simply a difference of opinion. It was a fundamental division about how to respond to an existential threat. And each side saw the other not just as mistaken, but as part of the problem, as contributing to chaos or to oppression. These divisions were so deep that many families fragmented, with parents and children becoming strangers to one another, unable to comprehend the different psychological responses each had developed to the same fear. Nuclear fear also created a complex relationship with authority. Governments possessed the power to initiate a war that would destroy everything, but they were also presented as the only ones capable of protecting people from this threat. This forced dependence created a profound ambivalence. People needed to trust their leaders to maintain peace, but also lived knowing that these same leaders had their fingers on the trigger of weapons of mass destruction. This ambivalence fueled both fervent patriotism and radical skepticism toward government. Beyond nuclear fear, there were other anxieties that permeated the decade. The Vietnam War became a growing focus of fear and division. Young men faced the very real prospect of being drafted and sent to fight in a war on the other side of the world, a war whose purpose was increasingly questioned. The fear of going into combat, of being injured, of never returning home, all of this weighed on an entire generation of young people and their families. But the fear related to Vietnam wasn't just about physical dangers. It was also about meaning and morality. As the war dragged on and the casualty count increased, many people began to question whether the sacrifice was worth it, whether the cause was just, whether their leaders were telling them the truth. Impactful images from the war arrived in living rooms through television, something unprecedented in American history. People saw the realities of conflict in a way that previous generations had never experienced. This created a crisis of confidence. If the government was willing to send young people to a war that increasingly seemed unjustifiable, with all the risks involved, what else was the government lying about? This erosion of trust in institutions had profound and lasting psychological consequences. A generation learned to question authority not out of adolescent rebellion, but because they had seen concrete evidence that authority was not trustworthy. For those who went to Vietnam, the psychological trauma was even more direct and devastating. Many soldiers returned home with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but at the time there was little recognition or treatment for their conditions. They had gone through incomprehensible experiences and then returned to a divided society where half the people saw them as heroes and the other half viewed them with disapproval. There was no clear path to reintegration, no healing ritual, no adequate recognition of their sacrifice or their trauma. This psychological abandonment of veterans had repercussions that extended for decades. Entire families were affected by the inability to process and heal war trauma. Children grew up with emotionally distant or volatile parents, unable to understand why their parents were that way. Untold and untreated trauma was transmitted across generations in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Another significant fear of the 60s was related to rapid social changes. The civil rights struggle challenged the established racial order, especially in the southern United States, but also throughout the country. For African Americans and their allies, there was the very real fear of facing hostilities. Civil rights activists faced physical resistance, unjust arrests, and acts of serious intimidation. The fear of participating in a peaceful march and suffering serious consequences was perfectly rational. But there was also fear on the other side. Many white people, especially in the South, felt that their way of life was under attack. This fear was often based on prejudice and privilege, but for those who felt it, it was very real. They feared the loss of status, the change in familiar social dynamics, the integration of schools and neighborhoods. This fear led them to vigorously defend segregation, often with hostile resistance. The clash of these opposing worldviews created an atmosphere of constant tension. Entire cities could experience moments of great conflict. The loss of important civil rights leaders, such as Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, demonstrated that even the most peaceful and eloquent defenders of change faced real dangers. This created a sense that nowhere was completely safe, that justice would require great sacrifice, that society was deeply fractured. For children who grew up observing these racial tensions, the lessons learned were profound. Some learned empathy and the importance of fighting for justice. Others learned fear and distrust of the other. Many learned that change comes at a significant cost and that challenging the status quo required great courage. These lessons shaped racial attitudes for generations. At the same time, changes in women's roles in society were beginning to accelerate. The birth control pill, available at the beginning of the decade, gave women unprecedented control over reproduction. The women's liberation movement was gaining strength, questioning old assumptions about women's place in society. For many women, this was exciting and liberating. Finally, there was the possibility of lives beyond wife and mother, of careers, of independence. But these changes also generated fear. Many women had been raised with very specific expectations about their roles and now faced a rapidly changing world where these expectations were being questioned. There was the fear of making the wrong choices, of missing opportunities, of being judged for following or for challenging traditional roles. For men, changes in gender roles could be equally disorienting, threatening identities built around certain expectations of masculinity and relationships. The personal liberation movement brought its own anxieties. Although it promised freedom and fulfillment, it also created new pressures and uncertainties. The old rules about relationships and personal expression were being dismantled, but the new rules weren't clear. How did you navigate intimacy in an era of changing values? How did you balance desire and responsibility? How did you deal with jealousy and possessiveness when traditional structures were being questioned? These were questions without easy answers, and many people felt lost. There were also more prosaic, but equally impactful, fears. The increase in urban crime in the 60s created anxiety about personal safety. Cities that were previously considered relatively safe were experiencing increases in crimes against property and person. This fed the fear of strangers, the desire to isolate in safe suburbs, the demand for tougher law and order policies. For many people, especially in urban centers, security-related fear was a daily concern. Economic changes also generated anxiety. Automation was beginning to eliminate certain types of jobs, especially in manufacturing. Workers who had spent decades developing specific skills discovered that these skills were no longer needed. There was the fear of obsolescence, of becoming irrelevant in a changing economy. This economic fear was especially acute for middle-aged men who were the primary providers for their families and who saw their ability to fulfill this role being threatened. The counterculture, although representing freedom and possibility for some, was a source of fear for others. Parents saw their children becoming hippies, dropping out of school, experimenting with substances, rejecting values that parents considered fundamental. There was the fear that an entire generation was losing its way, that the moral fabric of society was crumbling. Stories about cults, about young people who distanced themselves from their families going to San Francisco or Woodstock, about the dangers of substance use fed these fears. These various fears didn't exist in isolation. They intertwined and reinforced each other, creating a general atmosphere of uncertainty and anxiety. A person could be simultaneously worried about nuclear war, anguished about a son in Vietnam, anxious about racial changes in the neighborhood, and confused about changes in gender roles. The psychological burden was immense. How did people deal with this burden? Coping strategies varied enormously. Some turned to religion, seeking comfort and certainty in faith. Churches experienced both renewal and transformation during this period, with some becoming more conservative and others more progressive in response to social changes. Religion offered a sense of moral order, a framework for understanding chaos, and for many, the promise that even if the world ended, there would be salvation. Others sought escape through entertainment. Television became increasingly central to American life during the 60s. It offered a form of temporary disconnection from worldly concerns, a window into alternative realities where problems were solved in 30 minutes. But television also brought the world into the home in unprecedented ways, transmitting images of war, protests, and social tensions directly into living rooms. Many people dealt with their fears through denial or minimization. They focused on their daily lives, on their jobs, their families, their routines, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy amid chaos. This wasn't necessarily pathological. It was a survival strategy. You can't live in a state of constant panic. At some point, you need to find a way to function, to continue living, even when you're aware of the threats around you. Some channeled their fears into activism. If you were worried about nuclear war, you could participate in peace movements. If you were concerned about racial injustice, you could join the civil rights movement. If you were worried about the Vietnam War, you could protest against it. Activism offered a sense of agency, a way to transform passive fear into active action. It didn't eliminate fear, but it gave it purpose, direction. Others turned to substances. Problematic use of alcohol and substances increased during the 60s, both the recreational substances of the counterculture and the alcohol and prescribed tranquilizers of the dominant culture. For many, these substances were ways of dealing with anxiety, methods of dulling psychological pain, of creating temporary distance from oppressive concerns. Although this frequently created new problems, it offered short-term relief. The psychology of people shaped by these fears is complex and multifaceted. A common characteristic is a certain fundamental distrust. If you grew up knowing the world could end at any moment, that authorities weren't trustworthy, that social changes could be intense and turbulent, you developed a cautious perspective toward the world. This manifested in different ways. Some became skeptical of promises or guarantees, always looking for the catch, always expecting things to go wrong. Others developed a need for control, trying to manage every aspect of their lives because they felt so much was out of control. Many people shaped by the fears of the 60s developed what psychologists call hypertrophic vigilance. They were always scanning the environment for threats, always prepared for the worst. This could be exhausting, leading to chronic anxiety and stress-related health problems. But it could also make them particularly attentive to real risks, particularly good at contingency planning and emergency preparation. There was also a tendency toward dichotomous thinking. The world of the 60s was often presented in black and white terms, us versus them, right versus wrong. The Cold War was portrayed as a struggle between good and evil. The civil rights movement was framed as justice versus injustice. The Vietnam War divided people into supporters and opponents with little room for middle positions. Growing up in this environment could make it difficult to embrace nuances and ambiguities. Many people developed strongly polarized worldviews, seeing complex issues in simplistic terms. At the same time, the generation shaped by the 60s could also be remarkably idealistic. If you had seen people marching for civil rights, if you had witnessed the power of social movements, if you had experienced the possibility of radical change, you could develop a deep belief in the human potential for transformation. This idealism motivated many people to continue fighting for justice and change throughout their lives, even when facing disappointments and setbacks. For many, there was a constant tension between cynicism and idealism, between hope and despair. You wanted to believe things could get better, but you had seen too many terrible things to maintain naivety. This tension created a complex, sometimes contradictory perspective on the world. You could be simultaneously deeply skeptical of institutions and deeply committed to ideal values. Interpersonal relationships were also shaped by the fears of the era. Many people developed anxious attachment styles, having difficulty fully trusting others or feeling secure in relationships. If you had grown up in a world where everything seemed uncertain, where family bonds could be broken by political disagreement, where loved ones could be taken away by war or by the difficult events of the era, you might have difficulty believing that relationships were stable or lasting. At the same time, the generation of the 60s valued authenticity and emotional intimacy in ways that previous generations often didn't. There was a desire for genuine connections, for relationships based on honesty and mutual vulnerability rather than rigid social roles. This led to new forms of communication in relationships, an emphasis on expressing feelings and needs, but also new forms of conflict when these expectations weren't met. Parenting was also influenced by the fears of the era. Some parents, deeply marked by their own experience of growing up under constant threat, became overly protective, trying to shield their children from all possible dangers. Others went in the opposite direction, encouraging independence and resilience, wanting their children to be able to defend themselves in a dangerous world. Many oscillated between these extremes, uncertain about the right balance. There was also a tendency among those shaped by the 60s to pass their fears and anxieties to the next generation, sometimes in obvious ways, sometimes in subtle ways. Children picked up on their parents' latent nuclear fear, distrust of authority, racial tensions, even when these things weren't explicitly discussed. Intergenerational trauma is real and powerful. Fears that aren't processed and resolved are transmitted, embedding themselves in family patterns and expectations. But there was also resilience. Many people who grew up in the 60s developed remarkable strength, a capacity to deal with uncertainty and change because they had been forged in a crucible of fear and instability. They had learned they could survive difficult things, that they could adapt to changing circumstances, that they could find meaning even in chaotic times. This resilience was a gift, though hard one. The influence of the fears of the 60s extended far beyond that decade. People shaped by these fears carried their psychological perspectives into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. They became parents, teachers, business leaders, politicians, shaping institutions and culture in ways that reflected their formative experiences. Political debates of subsequent decades often reenacted divisions that originated in the 60s. The culture wars over values, family, race, and patriotism all had roots in that turbulent period. It's important to recognize that not everyone experienced the 60s in the same way. Experience varied enormously depending on race, class, geography, gender, and countless other factors. A young black person in rural Mississippi had a very different experience from a young white person in the suburbs of New York. A working-class woman in a factory had a different perspective from a middle-class college student. These differences in experience led to different psychologies, different ways of coping, different legacies. But there were common threads. Almost everyone who lived through the 60s experienced some level of uncertainty, anxiety, and fear. Almost everyone was forced to confront questions about mortality, morality, change, and identity in ways that were particularly intense and urgent. And almost everyone carried the marks of these experiences for the rest of their lives. Looking back now, with decades of distance, we can see patterns that perhaps weren't obvious at the time. We can see how collective fears shaped an entire generation, creating psychological trends that influenced half a century of history. We can see how unresolved trauma was transmitted across generations, creating patterns of anxiety and response that persist today. But we can also see strength, courage, and adaptability. People who lived through the 60s weren't passive victims of their fears. They found ways to resist, to thrive, to create meaning in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. They built families, careers, communities. They fought for justice and change. They loved, laughed, dreamed, despite everything. The psychology of people shaped by the fears of the 60s is, ultimately, a story about the human condition. It's about how we respond to threat, how we adapt to change, how we find hope in dark times. It's about the ways fear can diminish us and the ways it can make us grow. It's about the intergenerational transmission of trauma and resilience. Understanding this psychology is crucial not just for understanding the past, but for understanding our present and shaping our future. Many of the fears of the 60s, though taking new forms, are still with us. We still live under the shadow of nuclear weapons. We still struggle with racial divisions and social tensions. We still face questionable conflicts and crises of confidence in institutions. We still navigate rapid changes in gender roles and family structures. By studying how a previous generation dealt with their fears, we can learn lessons about how to deal with ours. We can see the mistakes that were made, the opportunities that were missed, but also the victories that were won and the resilience that was demonstrated. We can learn from the courage of those who resisted oppression, who spoke out against injustice, who refused to allow fear to paralyze them completely. We can also learn from the mistakes. We can see how the failure to process and heal traumas led to long-term consequences. We can see how polarization and dichotomous thinking made it difficult to find common ground and work toward solutions. We can see how unexamined fears can be manipulated by those in power to control and divide people. The psychology of people shaped by the fears of the 60s reminds us that we are products of our time, shaped by the historical circumstances in which we live. But it also reminds us that we are not completely determined by these circumstances. We have agency. We have choice. We can decide how to respond to our fears, what lessons to draw from our experiences, what values to embrace and defend. For those who lived through the 60s, reflecting on these experiences can be both painful and liberating. It can bring up difficult memories, old fears that were never completely resolved. But it can also offer perspective, an understanding of why you are who you are, why you respond to the world the way you do. It can be a first step toward healing, toward integrating past experiences in ways that allow for greater peace and authenticity in the present. For younger generations, understanding the psychology of those shaped by the fears of the 60s can promote empathy and understanding. It can explain why your parents or grandparents are the way they are, why they have certain fears or priorities that might seem incomprehensible. It can help break intergenerational patterns of trauma, allowing new generations to make conscious choices about what to inherit and what to leave behind. The 1960s was a moment of profound transformation, driven by both hope and fear. It was a time when the best and worst of human nature were on full display. It was a time that demanded extraordinary courage from ordinary people. And the psychological marks of that era continue to reverberate, shaping who we are as a society and as individuals. As we conclude this exploration of the psychology of people shaped by the fears of the 60s, it's important to recognize that the story continues. The legacies of that decade are still being written. People who lived through those times are still making choices, still influencing the world, still processing and integrating their experiences. And those of us who came after carry our own legacies, our own responses to the fears of our own time. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: fear is part of the human condition. There will always be threats, uncertainties, reasons for anxiety. But how we choose to respond to these fears defines who we are. We can allow fear to paralyze us, divide us, diminish us. Or we can use fear as a catalyst for courage, compassion, meaningful action. We can allow unresolved fears to be transmitted across generations, or we can do the difficult work of healing them, breaking destructive patterns. People shaped by the fears of the 60s did the best they could with the resources they had. Some thrived. Others struggled. Most did a bit of both. Their stories, their psychologies, their legacies are complex and multifaceted. They deserve to be understood with nuance, empathy, and honesty. As we face our own contemporary fears, whether climate change, political instability, pandemics, or threats we can't yet predict, we carry with us the lessons of those who came before. We carry their resilience, their courage, but also their warnings about the costs of unresolved trauma, of polarization, and of unexamined fear. May we learn from the past while remaining fully present in our own moment. May we recognize our fears without being defined by them. May we seek healing, understanding, and connection, even amid uncertainty. And may we trust, as did those who faced the fears of the 60s, that we are capable of more courage, compassion, and resilience than we sometimes believe possible. May the Lord God grant us the wisdom to learn from the past, the courage to face our present fears, and the hope to build a future where the next generations can live with less anxiety and more peace. May we honor those who faced difficult times, transmitting not just their fears, but also their strength, not just their traumas, but also their victories, not just their divisions, but also their shared humanity.